welcome to the past. It is a pleasure for both Lillian and for me to be here, to see people that were here a long time ago, and it's good to see them again. I want to share with you some stories and also some personal reflections of our time with this church. In 1955, we were serving the Stamping Ground Christian Church down in Scott County. And on a Sunday just before Christmas and Advent, 3 elders from this congregation walked into the church late as they were singing "We Three Kings of the Orient Are." You can imagine that in a small rural church, it was not too difficult. You didn't have to be a rocket scientist to know that this was a pulpit committee. But that was the beginning of what had happened earlier. Life has all kind of strange and wonderful coincidences. As a young boy growing up in Anniston, Alabama, my minister was Forrest King. By the time I arrived in seminary, he was the state secretary, which is what they call the regional minister in those days. I went to him and said, I think it's time for me to move. He said, Don, there are 3 churches that are open right now here in Kentucky. I want you to look at all 3 of them. But I want you to look real close at the one up in Florence. I think it has real potential. I followed his suggestions, went to the other churches, and came here. And there was that something that said, he's right. This church has a great potential. And so began our life together. In 1956, the church, not only here, but everywhere in the United States, was experiencing a boom time. Those of you a little bit older than Susan can remember that churches, they were building a new church every week in the United States. The little white church that stood on the corner that had been there a long time, we had chairs in the aisle and we were experiencing attendance not like the attendance today. It was a boom time. And the community was booming. One of the stories that I won't tell, but I'll just mention, I was out calling one afternoon, and in a boom town, we had a private telephone company, and about every 6th or 7th person, our household had a phone. I called on this family. The lady invited me in. She had 2 small children. She was a newcomer to the community, as were most of the people. And I mentioned that I had been at Stamping Ground. She said, oh, I knew somebody there. Let me go upstairs and get their picture. So she ran upstairs, and I heard her trip as she started back down. And there's nothing more horrible than hearing somebody tumbling down steps. I had been a Boy Scout, and I heard somewhere that you leave a person that's fallen down steps alone until you get help. So what do? You have 2 children, there's no phone. So I had to get in my car, go a mile up to a grocery store, call the 911, which, by the way, in those days was a funeral director. He came, got her into the stretcher and headed for the hospital. And I had 2 children I had to do something with. So I picked them up, put them in the car, dropped them off at the parsonage, and I said to Lillian, honey, take care of these kids. I'll explain to you later. And you know, that lady joined the Baptist church. coming to the little white church on the corner, I want to tell something about the legends of those who were here before me. In those days, in the darker days of the Depression, I am told that the more affluent member of the church, it was the only millionaire that they had in the church then. I know you have several now, but there was very little money circulating in the community. And on Sunday morning, Mr. X would come down, pick up the offering, which was always meager because there was very little money, reach into his billfold and give to the preacher a $10 bill. Brother Robert Carter, who was the minister, served during those days and survived because he was also a public school teacher down in Petersburg. With the crowd, we faced a real problem. We know what you got to do, but how do you start? We needed a new building. And so we got the plans for an educational building, which is still over there where the offices are now, and went through all of the process. The board, the congregation approved moving ahead with this, meaning that they would have to borrow some money. Well, we had a contractor and it sounded like everything was wonderful, and it was summertime, and so we took a vacation, as we usually did, to go to see our parents. When I got back, nothing had happened. I called up the contractor and I said, what's happening here? He said, well, a policeman came up here and told me we had to stop work. We didn't have a building permit. Well, in those golden days, they didn't usually require a building permit of church. So we realized that something was afoot here that we didn't quite understand. And the board chair called an emergency meeting on Sunday night. And as I recall, I may miss the number, but there were about 26 board members there, circled around in the back room of the little white church. And he said, we're here for one reason tonight. We want to decide, are we going to go ahead or not? And I want each one of you, as you come around, to say either yay or nay. There were 23 yays and 3 nays. Mr. X, who had something to do with the policeman being there, raised his hand and he said, may I go get the building permit? And a new day was being born here in Florence. We had eventually the education building and then the building that you are in now that has had its improvements since we were here. I want to mention a couple of things that I can remember, one of which we had a person, a family in the church at that time that had a mentally challenged child. And one time at a meeting, he raised his hand and he said, I wish you would do something for our daughter. And out of that, a discussion, a invitation was given to the community, and at that time it was called the Boone County Council on Mental Retardation. That's not the name now. But it was born in the education building next door. And this group was amazing, had a large group that came from all over the community. In those days, there was no special education, so the first thing they did was to raise a scholarship so they could get a teacher qualified for special ed. The program worked, and Boone County had their first special ed class. One of the people in this church who had a severely challenged child came to me and said, could we use one of the rooms for a class for these that didn't make the grade to go to the special ed class? If you want to have experienced a miracle, to have seen how those children prospered under that love and attention of that parent. And so it was. Not only was this a boom time in the life of our community, but it was also a tense time. This was a time of the Cold War. It was a time when the Cuban crisis occurred. It was the time of the assassination of our President, John F. Kennedy. And this church was host to the first service in which Roman Catholics joined with us in a service of concern and remembrance to express our grief. I don't want to take all the time. We could spend a lot of the stories. I had the opportunity or the adventure of being a part of the Florence Volunteer Fire Department. And that was, in a sense, an outreach of this church. But I want to go back to my first story, because this church still has potential. The church is not the same in some ways, but in other ways it is still the same. That we are facing the challenge of how do we best serve in the world in which we live. And every generation has to face the question that the 26 people on the board did here over 50 years ago. How do you vote? Do you vote yea or do you vote nay? It's a continuing question, and the success of any church is when the people agree. This would have been another chapter, but this church, to have the first building and the second, had to learn stewardship. Somebody had taken care of them for a long time, and it took a long time to develop the spirit of joyful giving that you now have. God bless you as you face this new day.
Amen. Amen. Amen.